You saw that cracked concrete floor in the thumbnail, and you know the one in your own home, the gray, dusty, spider-web slab in the basement or the garage that you've been told needs to be ripped out. Here's what I'll prove to you tonight. That floor does not need a contractor, a jackhammer, or $4,000. It needs about $5 of cement patch and a jar of the right varnish, brushed on the way the Amish have done it for over 100 years, and it will outlast the fancy epoxy your neighbor paid a fortune for. I learned this the hard way, standing in a barn in Lancaster County, watching an old man laugh at what I'd spent. Stay with me, because near the end I'm going to hand you something I found buried in a United States government farm bulletin from 1910, a mixing detail that almost nobody alive still remembers. And if you already own an older home with a floor you thought was ruined, this is exactly for you. You don't need to build anything new. You need to fix what you already have. I want to take you back about 9 years, because I need you to understand how stubborn I was. I had a concrete floor in my basement workshop that was flaking apart, little gray crumbs everywhere. Every time I swept up part of the floor itself. So I did what you're supposed to do. I called 3 companies. I got 3 quotes. The cheapest was $3,100 to grind it down and pour a new topping and seal it with a 2-part epoxy they swore would last a decade. I remember standing there holding that quote in my kitchen, and my wife just looked at me and said, "For a floor nobody sees but you." And she was right. But I didn't have a better idea, so I nearly signed. Then that fall I ended up spending real time with an Amish family in Pennsylvania, and everything I thought I knew about floors got turned upside down. I was helping a man named Amos move some feed sacks in his shop, and I looked down at his floor. Now this was a working floor. Horses came through part of that building, wagons, steel-shod boots, day after day, year after year, and that concrete was smooth, sealed, almost glowing, a warm honey color, with no cracks and no dust. I asked him when he'd had it done. He didn't understand the question at first. "Done?" he said. Then he understood I meant hired out. And he laughed, not a mean laugh, just genuinely tickled. He told me his father had poured that floor, and that he himself had sealed it, and that the whole treatment, the whole thing, cost him almost nothing. I didn't believe him. I said so, right to his face. I told him about my $3,100 quote, and that's when he set down the sack he was carrying and walked me over to a shelf. On that shelf was a can of Portland cement, a small bag of fine sand, and a jar of amber liquid that turned out to be boiled linseed oil varnish. That was it. That was the whole arsenal that kept a horse barn floor perfect for 30 years. He picked up the jar of amber oil and held it up to the light coming through the window, and he said something I've never forgotten. He said, "This is what the world used before the world decided it needed something to sell you every year. The reason you and I have never heard of this, the reason we go straight to the phone and call a contractor, isn't because this old method stopped working. It works better than ever. The reason is that nobody makes money when your floor lasts 30 years. Think about that. A 2-part epoxy kit is a product. It has a shelf life, a warranty, a reorder. The grinding is a service. The sealing is a service. Every crack that comes back in 5 years is a service. There is an entire industry that depends on your floor failing on schedule. But a can of Portland cement, a scoop of sand, and boiled linseed oil, there's no salesman knocking on your door for that. There's no glossy commercial. Nobody's getting rich when a man in a barn does it himself for the price of a sandwich. So it got quiet. It got pushed to the back of the shelf, and then off the shelf entirely. Let me tell you what Amos actually showed me, because the details are everything here, and the details are exactly what got buried. He explained that a concrete floor isn't really solid the way you think it is. It's full of tiny pores, like a hard sponge. That's why it dusts. That's why it flakes. Water and moisture creep up from the ground through those pores, and every freeze, every temperature swing, every bit of moisture works the surface loose from the inside. The cracks you see on top started as weakness you couldn't see. Modern epoxy tries to solve this by laying a thick plastic skin on top of the concrete. And here's the problem with that skin, the part the salesman doesn't mention. When moisture pushes up from below, and it always does in a basement, in a garage, against the ground, that plastic skin has nowhere to go. So it bubbles, it peels, it lifts off in sheets. I've seen 2-year-old epoxy floors peeling like a bad sunburn. The Amish method does the opposite. Instead of sitting on top, the boiled linseed oil soaks down into those pores and hardens inside the concrete. It doesn't make a skin. It turns the top layer of the floor itself into something dense and sealed and water-resistant from the inside out. The floor still breathes a little, so moisture doesn't tear it apart, but it stops dusting. It stops absorbing. It stops flaking. And here's the part that made me feel like a fool for that quote I almost signed. This isn't Amish folklore that somebody made up. This is documented science, and it's old. The United States Department of Agriculture put out farmers' bulletins in the early 1900s, practical guides sent to every farm in America, and boiled linseed oil as a concrete floor treatment shows up in that literature. By 1910, agricultural colleges tested it. They found that concrete treated with repeated coats of linseed oil resisted water absorption dramatically better than untreated concrete, and it hardened the surface against wear. Not a guess. A measured result from land-grant universities more than 100 years ago. They knew. Our great-grandfathers knew, and then somewhere in the middle of the last century, the knowledge got paved over by products. Now let me tell you how the crack repair works. Because before you seal a floor, you have to fix what's broken. And this is where that $5 really goes to work. Amos took me through it slow, because he could tell I was the kind of man who'd rush it and blame the method. First, he said, you never patch a crack as thin as it looks on top. A crack is like an iceberg. You take a cold chisel or the corner of a scraper and you widen it. You actually open it up a little, and this is the part that feels wrong. You undercut the edges so the groove is wider at the bottom than at the top. Why? Because that shape locks the patch in. A straight-sided crack lets the patch pop right back out. A crack that's wider underneath grips the new cement like a dovetail joint grips wood. That one trick is the difference between a repair that lasts 3 months and one that lasts 30 years. Then you clean it, really clean it. Vacuum every crumb, every speck of dust, because dust is what keeps the patch from bonding. And here's the step almost everyone skips: you wet it. You dampen the old concrete before you pack in the new. Dry old concrete is thirsty. If you pack wet patch into a dry crack, the old floor drinks the water right out of your fresh cement before it can cure, and the patch turns to powder. Amos wet that crack down until it was damp but not puddled every single time. For the patch itself, he mixed Portland cement with fine sand, roughly 1 part cement to 2 or 3 parts sand, and just enough water to make it like thick peanut butter, never soupy. He packed it in hard with a putty knife, pressing down so there were no air pockets, and struck it off flush with the floor. And then the secret that separates a farm patch from a failure: he didn't just leave it to dry. He covered it with a damp cloth and a scrap of plastic, and he let it cure slow, keeping it damp for 2 or 3 days. Concrete doesn't dry, it cures. It's a chemical reaction, not evaporation, and the slower and damper it cures, the harder and stronger it gets. Rush it in the open air and it cracks again. Let it cure slow and it becomes part of the floor forever. That's it. That's the crack repair. Cement, sand, water, a chisel, and patience. Total cost, if you already have a bag of Portland cement in the garage, is close to nothing. If you don't, a small bag runs a few dollars, and it'll fix every crack in your house. And that one sentence is the whole reason I'm talking to you tonight. If this way of thinking speaks to you, recovering the old methods, the ones that actually work, before they disappear for good, I want to mention that I've put together a collection of this exact kind of knowledge in a book called Amish Hacks. It goes deep into the practical skills and forgotten remedies that Amish families have kept alive for generations, the kind of thing Amos showed me that afternoon that no contractor will ever tell you about. There's also deeper roots in Amish Complete if you want to go even further. All of it is in the description below, and it's the closest thing I know to sitting down with a man like Amos yourself. Because here's what I started to realize, and it made me angry the more I dug into it. But patching the cracks only stops the visible damage. It doesn't stop the reason the cracks came back. And that brings me to the part I nearly got wrong even after Amos showed me the ceiling, because I tried to cheat it and it punished me. Now, I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, that's fine for a man building a barn from scratch, but my house is 50 years old and my floor's already a mess. I want to talk straight to you for a minute, because this next part was made for your house, not for some new build. You do not need to tear anything out. You do not need a permit. You do not need a contractor to walk through your door and tell you what it'll cost. Everything I'm about to describe you can do this weekend on the floor you already own with your own 2 hands and nobody's permission. Here's how you seal an old floor the Amish way. First, you get it clean and dry, really dry. Give it a couple of warm days if the floor's been damp. Then you take your boiled linseed oil, and this is the detail I got wrong, so learn from my mistake. You do not brush it on thick and straight from the can. Thick, it just sits on top, stays sticky, and never cures. It'll be tacky for weeks, and you'll curse my name. You thin the first coat. For that very first coat, you cut the boiled linseed oil about half and half with a solvent, traditionally turpentine, so it becomes thin and watery and soaks deep into those hungry pores instead of sitting on top. That first thin coat is the one that does the real work, driving down into the concrete and starting to harden it from the inside. You brush it on or roll it, and you watch. Wherever it disappears fast, that's thirsty concrete, and you feed it more until it stops drinking. Then you let it cure. Not overnight. Boiled linseed oil is slow, and it needs air and time, usually a day or 2 per coat, longer in a cold basement. Then the second coat, a little less thinned. Then a third, closer to full strength. Each coat builds on the last, and the color deepens to that warm honey glow I saw in Amos's barn. 3 coats, cured slow, and you have a floor that beads water, doesn't dust, doesn't flake, and wipes clean. And I have to stop you on one safety point, because I promised you the truth and this matters. Rags soaked in boiled linseed oil can catch fire on their own. It's real. As the oil cures, it gives off heat, and a wadded-up oily rag in a warm corner can smolder and ignite with no spark at all. So when you're done, you lay those rags flat outside to dry, or you drop them in a bucket of water. Don't ball them up in the trash. Amos taught me that before he taught me anything else, and I'm passing it to you the same way. So why did this beautiful, cheap, proven method disappear from every hardware store's advice? Here's where it stops being a story about floors and starts being a story about who profits from your ignorance. When the big chemical companies came up with polyurethane and two-part epoxy after the Second World War, they had something linseed oil, never had a marketing budget. Epoxy could be branded, patented, packaged, and priced. Linseed oil is just linseed oil. You can't patent a pressed flax seed. Flax has been pressed for its oil for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians did it. So the trade magazines, the contractor catalogs, the store displays, they all filled up with the products somebody could own and sell. And the old bulletins, the ones from the agricultural colleges that measured how well linseed oil worked, went into the basement of some library, and nobody pulled them out again. The Amish never stopped, because the Amish were never inside that system in the first place. They didn't read the catalogs. They didn't watch the commercials. They kept doing what worked because it worked and because it cost almost nothing, and cost matters when you live within your means on purpose. And that's the thing that finally got under my skin. It wasn't just that I almost wasted $3,100. It's that the knowledge to avoid it was deliberately allowed to disappear, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too cheaply for anyone to profit. Let me give you the numbers side by side, because this is where it hits home. That epoxy quote was $3,100, warranted for 10 years, and I've since watched epoxy floors fail in 2 or 3 when there's moisture underneath. Call it $300 a year at best, and a peeling mess at worst. The Amish method: a bag of Portland cement, a bag of sand, a quart or 2 of boiled linseed oil, a can of turpentine runs you somewhere between $15 and $30 for an entire basement floor, and if you already had some of it on hand, closer to that $5 in the title. And it doesn't last 10 years. Amos's floor was past 30 and still perfect. When it does finally need help, you don't tear it out, you just brush on another coat of oil. 15 minutes, a couple of dollars, and it's new again. That's the difference between owning your home and renting your repairs from a company that needs you to fail on schedule. Now, I told you at the start I'd hand you something I found buried in that 1910-era government literature, a detail almost nobody alive still uses. This is the part I want you to lean in for, because it took me 2 years and a lot of reading to understand why Amos's floor looked so much better than my first attempt, even though I followed his steps. Here it is. When I finally went digging through those old agricultural bulletins and the college experiment station reports from the early 1900s, I found that the very best results, the hardest, most water-resistant concrete surfaces they ever measured, didn't come from linseed oil brushed onto finished concrete at all. They came from treating the concrete while it was still young. And there was a specific old practice written down in that era of warming the linseed oil before applying it. Warm oil. That was the missing piece. They found that gently warmed boiled linseed oil, warmed in a container set in hot water, never over an open flame, because it's flammable, flows thinner, and penetrates far deeper into the pores than cold oil straight from the can. Cold oil sits near the surface. Warm oil sinks down into the concrete and hardens deep, where all that flaking and dusting actually begins. I tried it. I set the jar in a pan of hot water off the stove until the oil was warm to the touch, thinned that first coat with turpentine, and brushed it onto a damp-free, clean old floor. And it drank it. The concrete pulled that warm, thin oil down like nothing I'd seen. When it cured, the surface wasn't just sealed on top, it was hardened a quarter-inch down. That floor has taken everything for years now, and it still beads water like a waxed car. That's the secret finale. Warm the oil, thin the first coat, cure it slow. It's written in American farm records from over 100 years ago. It's exactly what kept those Amish barn floors alive for generations, and it costs you nothing extra but a pan of hot water and a little patience. One family kept it alive when the whole modern world walked away from it. An old man in a barn in Lancaster County held up a jar to the light and told me the truth, and now I've handed it to you. So the next time you look at that cracked gray floor and feel that sinking dread of a four-figure quote, I want you to remember that you were never actually stuck. You were just never told. The fix has been sitting in plain sight for over a century, waiting for someone to blow the dust off it. You're the kind of person who would rather do a thing right with your own hands than pay someone to do it wrong. That's not cheapness. That's self-respect. And it's the same instinct that kept these Amish families free of a system built to keep the rest of us paying forever. Now do something for me. I want to know about the floor you've been staring at. Tell me in the comments. Is it a basement, a garage, or an old porch slab? And how long have you been putting off fixing it because of what you thought it would cost? Write it down below. I read them and I answer. And if any part of tonight made you angry that this was ever taken from us, then join us, subscribe, and stand with the people who are pulling this old knowledge back out of the dark, one forgotten trick at a time. Because next time I'm going to show you the Amish way of mixing a whitewash that not only brightens a barn but actually kills mold on contact with a single cheap ingredient the paint companies would very much prefer you forget. Stay with me. We're just getting started digging this back up. Before you go, one more thing. Tonight I showed you the overview, but the full Amish floor recipe, with that 1910 mixing detail Amos guarded, is waiting inside the plain living circle. In there you can ask me your own questions, and a real person, me, answers you myself. And you won't be alone, folks, like you are already inside. Just point your phone's camera at the code on your screen. Cancel any time with one click.